Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we will feel what it was like to be Blackbeard, the most feared pirate of the Caribbean. We will stand on the deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, hear the crash of cannon fire, and watch the smoke twist through the wind as fear itself becomes a weapon. This immersive history was created based on Angus Constam's book Blackbeard and Russell K. Skowronek and Charles R. Ewan's book Dead Man's Chest. Their research helps us step closer into the life behind the legend, the sailor, the captain, and the man who ruled the waves for one brief, ruthless year. You can find these sources and further reading in the pinned comment. And if you enjoy these journeys, you can help our circle grow by liking and subscribing. In the comments, share what other time or place you would like us to experience together. Now draw your cutlass and brace for the wind. The hunt begins. Chapter 1. A Harbor of Easy Welcome. Our story begins in Nassau. Imagine you are a tall sailor in the year 1716, with the creak of wet rope above. The harbor sits open like a friendly hand, and small jobs lie close at every pier. Men come and go in pairs, some with a grin, some with a wary glance, each mind set on the same small needs. A sloop named Queen Anne's Revenge will one day make your name feared during a bold blockade, and folks will swear they saw fire in your whiskers and doom in your stride. That is the tale they will tell later, because people like a sharp edge on a story. But for now the talk stays simple, as coins pass palm to palm, and easy work waits near. A lighter must be pushed to a ship, a deck must be scrubbed, a sail needs new patches before a short run up the islands. It is a life of plain steps, one done after another, and each step pays for the next day. There is comfort in that steady path. Even a dreamer learns to nod and take what is offered. A man can grow into himself in such a place. Patience, that is the first skill learned here, and it never goes to waste. Harbor life moved by the tide and by the slow exchange of favors, and the smell of tar rose from new seams pressed along a skiff's planks. A lad carried a bucket, a mate called for a hand with a line, and an older fellow nodded as he set out his net for drying. Nothing grand, no trumpet to it, just decent work in the sun. Stories were traded as if they were coins, and not one of them could feed a man by itself. That was the way of things, and no one griped much when the work swung dull. Nassau had room for drifters and the steady kind alike. Even a hothead could learn to wait for the right wind here. There were rules as soft as old rope, and if a man kept to them, he found friends on the quay. The shore never asked a name if the job was done clean and the pay was fair. In a world full of hard choices, that easy welcome mattered more than most. When wages came short, stew and a bench were enough, and the taste of thin rum cut the edge off long hours. A man sat at a table, told one firm truth and two soft lies, and the room answered with a laugh that carried no harm. Cards slid back and forth, but few had skill for cards, so bones and luck did for an evening. No one blamed a poor hand. A poor hand could be played well if the head was steady. It was the same on water. A simple task, done again and again, built more strength than a wild boast. Men who talked too loud learned soon to talk a little less. A new face found a corner and a seat and watched how the place breathed. This was not the life of heroes, not yet, and that was a comfort. You could find your way step by step and miss the worst of it, at least for a while. Patience kept a man whole as much as muscle did. Some days a boat put out only as far as the point, and men scraped barnacles while the sun pressed down warm on the back of a bare neck. Lines were checked and marked, a new splice learned under a mate's eye, and knots were tied and untied until they made sense. There were more lessons in small chores than in bravado, and the old hands knew it well. No one rushed a green man past what he could hold. That saved lives later, and lives meant shares. Talk of law or war sat at the edge of the day like a cloud that might drift off. A flag seen on the far water could be friend or trouble, but guessing wrong brought no wage, so men kept their peace. There was a time for boldness, and there was a time for quiet work. This was the quiet time. It laid a base for whatever might come, and that base had to be strong. Short runs along the shoals taught more than stories ever did, and the sight of a pale wake trailing straight astern showed a hand well set to the wind. A body learned to judge drift by the way a bit of weed slipped past the beam. A fellow learned the feel of the helm without thinking, though he would not brag about it. Every small success made the next one easier, and that was the secret of the thing. Charts were few, but eyes were keen, and a careful head beat a loud promise in any season. The work turned into a habit, and habit turned into craft. Men speak later of daring, but the truth is steadier and slower. It comes in little gains, tiny steps on a plain day. There is no shame in that. It is how most strong tales begin, even if no one in a tavern sings about it after. Wisdom takes root in common dirt, not in thunder. On nights ashore, the street kept a soft mood, and the sound of a fiddle scraped slow in a doorway while boots shuffled around it. Words were plain and jokes ran harmless, since tomorrow meant sweat and no one wanted to wear out his voice on foolishness. A man could rest his elbows on a plank and talk of tides, or sit quiet and watch who came and went. A kindly woman might pass a bowl, and a boy might take a message down to the pier without a question. The place held to a kind of truce that made sense to most. The men who broke it did not last, and that was lesson enough to the rest. There was a little pride in keeping to the unwritten way. It smoothed the rough bits out. The night closed without drama, and a bunk called as sure as bell time on a ship. Nothing grand, but every life needs simple corners where a soul can breathe. Soon enough the hands began to know the shape of a larger path, and the scratch of coarse whiskers under a palm said time moved on without asking. A frame filled out with work, a voice grew a notch deeper, and the look in the eye turned steady. There were chances to take if a man kept his wits. A berth with better shares might come by after a small show of skill. An older mate threw a glance and a short nod, and that meant more than a speech. It signaled trust, and trust opened doors a knock could not. A person need not hurry toward a legend. Let the world talk when it wished. Life had its own pace, and a careful step was not the same as a lazy one. Even the boldest tale rests on such small proofs. That is worth remembering when people tell the later parts with a grin and a shiver. By the end of that season, the harbour looked like a map to the mind, and the sight of dawn, laying a thin pink line across the roadstead, made each start feel sure. Word moved that a firm captain sought steady men, and the name Benjamin Hornigold slipped across a bench in low tones. No one shouted it. There was no need. A man who kept his head down could hear what mattered, and let the rest blow by. The road that leads to loud fame often begins with a quiet step toward a useful teacher. So it was here. Work first, then the bolder parts that make the songs. That is the honest order. The sloop that would carry a grander name was still only a hint in the back of the mind. For now the harbour gave a plain welcome. The day offered honest tasks, and the next tide promised a chance to learn. And that is where we leave this first part, with the path opening and the heart steady for what comes next. Chapter 2. Under Hornigold's Wing. Benjamin Hornigold took a tall seaman under his wing as the harbour eased back into work after a run of good prizes. A letter of marque lay folded in a tin, and the old man kept it dry as a priest holds a psalm, because the paper made raids seem lawful in those years. He set down his rules in a voice that needed no curse to land hard, no harm to English flags, fair shares when a haul came in, and steady hands when weather turned. Days ran along the shoals off Nassau with clean lines and little waste, and the habit of order bit in without fuss. You watched and copied, taking the coil from an older hand and laying it back again, because that was the way to rise from swab to a place by the helm. Hornigold spoke plain, and asked for the same in return, and a nod from him felt like pay in itself. The ships he chose were soft fruit, mostly Spanish coasters and slow French traders, and he taught patience before glory, saying that a long season beat one wild day. The smell of warm pitch from the seams marked each hour, and it stuck in clothes and beard the way a lesson sticks in the head. Men grew by what they did over and over, and there was comfort in that. Under him, small skills turned into a path, one careful step after another, and there was no need to rush the next. That was the soundness of his guard, and it set the tone. Work at sea, under Hornigold, moved like a drill that never felt harsh. Watches were kept to time, and each job had a pair of hands that knew when to step in and when to wait. A green hand learned to reef without trampling, and to keep gear ready without making a show of order. The old man pointed out the lines of a hull and the set of a mast from far off, and taught which crews might play stubborn and which would fold if hailed. He He said a chase worth the powder often ended before the first shot, and he proved it by steering in strong and talking calm. No English flag was bothered, and there was pride in that, because a little honor held a crew together better than a threat. When the ship lay at rest, the young men worked the seams, wiped the blades, and aired the clothes, then stood back as if a house had been set straight. There was little bold talk, and much steady learning, and a man saw how the sea rewarded clean habits with fewer hard knocks. Currents near the reef taught more than any book, and Hornigold pointed out how water set a hull, even when the wind fell. The signal was given, the course was held, and the next task followed without fuss. The gulls called across the water during those slow tasks, and the sound ran between the men as if to keep time. It all built a place to stand, so when harder days came, there would be no surprise. That was how Hornigold shaped a crew, bit by bit. Trust came by inches, never all at once. A man who showed up on time and kept his temper soon found his name called for better work. Boat handling was handed down on easy evenings, with an older sailor pointing out how weight should be shifted and how to keep blades clear of one another in crowded water. Hornigold watched without fuss and made his remark only at the end, and the measure of it could lift a heart for days. A watch by the cabin followed, then a chance to count stores, then a word carried to the quartermaster and back, all of it proving that a steady mind could hold tasks the way a hull held its shape. Small choices were explained in plain words so a man could reason on them later, because sense was a better guard than fear. The rough burn of hemp on hands told where a line had run well and where it had been pinched, and that simple lesson stayed longer than any scold. He learned to read faces, so orders could be given the right way when tempers ran close. Soon you found yourself standing between the old man and the crew when news had to travel clean, and you learned to soften blows without hiding facts. There was plain pride in that, the kind that did not need a toast. In time, the same hand was sent first into a boat to parley, and the voice used there turned calm from practice, not from nature. That was growth under his eye, and it felt sound. Ashore, the crew passed evenings in easy company, where money could be spent without shame. Nassau was not fine, but it offered a table, a bench, and a room where jokes did not draw a blade. Stories went around of men who ran wild, yet Hornigold's lot kept a lid on it, because a good berth could vanish if foolishness drew the wrong eyes. A trusted man learned to keep talk plain, to let others boast, and to save the better coin for the ship's next need. There were girls who knew the names and chose their own terms, and there were traders who held grudges but loved silver more, and that mix made a kind of peace. Back on board, the meals stayed simple, with a crust of hardtack when stores had to stretch, and no one complained, because hunger taught better than sermons. The ale at the tavern tasted thin but honest, and that small taste seemed to bless the night without promising more than it could give. Men needed small good things when days ran long, and a plain drink could do the job. At the table, a man kept shoulders aside so no elbow started a quarrel, and that spared many a fool's wound. Hornigold himself sometimes sat in a corner and listened rather than led, and the crew took their cue from that. The world felt larger but not wild when a man learned to carry himself without show. In those days, a steady face counted for more than glory, and that simple truth was a safe harbor. Skills for harder work were taught without rush. Hornigold did not fill heads with brave talk. He showed small things that made larger things safer. He taught where to stand so as not to be counted before the time, how to speak so a voice carried calm, and how to keep men close without crowding them. One evening, he set a cutlass on the table and talked about weight and balance, the way a plain tool could be more than a threat when the hand on it stayed measured. He said the trick was never to look eager, because eager men made enemies before they knew it. Steps were practiced until they felt like walking down a street, and a turn of the wrist was done again and again until muscle remembered better than the mind. He showed how to rest the hand so the edge did not shake, because the shake told on a mind. The long steel showed a pale line when a lamp caught it just so, and that single sight fixed the lesson better than words. A steady manner helped too, because a man in command did not need to shout. Those who learned best found their shoulders easy and their mouths shut as often as they spoke. It was a kind of schooling that built power without making a show, and it steadied the nerves. What mattered was control, and control could be learned with time. Out on the wide water, the work showed itself in calm stops rather than storms of powder. With the letter of marque safe in the tin, Hornigold pointed toward coasters that would not bring down trouble, and the crew bore in with a show of readiness that rarely needed more. The signal was given, the other side found the order and numbers plain, and nerves gave way to sense. Papers were shown, goods were counted fair, and a share was taken when the law allowed it, with the packet held up for all. A man sent over, learned to keep his hands where all eyes could read them, and to speak to the master as if time itself had slowed. It was careful work, and it kept blood off the deck and rage out of mouths. A distant sail sat like a clean white triangle most mornings, and that single sight told the crew whether a chase was worth the hours it would take. Sometimes the course turned away when the mark proved English, and no one grumbled because the line Hornigold held made their beds safe in the long run. If bargains set terms instead of fear, all went smoother, and Hornigold never scorned a calm bargain. The prizes that did come were enough to keep bellies full and tempers kind. There was pride in doing it that way, and thanks that no mothers were left to mourn because someone rushed. That was the point of law, as Hornigold used it. In those months, the line between privateer and pirate was walked with care and with eyes open. Hornigold set his weight on the side of law as far as it would carry them, and that choice shaped the way men saw themselves. Shares were weighed out fair, squabbles were settled face to face, and a man with a gripe could speak before the crew without fear of a lash. The letter of marque sat wrapped and hidden unless needed, like a key that opened one door and kept shut another, and its place in the tin was checked as often as stores were counted. When a master asked to see it, a trusted man brought it out slow, unfolded it clean, and held it so the seal faced him as custom asked. The paper felt stiff at the fold, and that touch reminded all that words on a page could hold back powder and steel when common sense might fail. Now and then a mate asked whether the paper tied hands too tight, and the talk ran on until sense returned. Pride grew from that, not the loud kind, but the sort that made a man stand straight. This was not the wild life of tales. Not yet. This was work, and it gave a clear head and a better sleep. Hornigold knew it, and the crew learned it, and that steady ground kept them from slipping when chance teased them toward easy plunder. It was a way of being that built a name. By the time the season turned, you were ready for more than errands and small talks across a rail. The next step would ask for nerve and a tighter hold on fear, and the old captain knew when to ease back and when to push a pupil forward. There were signals to practice and a tone to strike, so that a crew leaned in without panic, and these were done again and again until they felt natural. Stories spread from ship to ship about harsher captains and darker flags, and sometimes those stories were weighed in the mind because men measured their place by what others dared. Under Hornigold, the measure stayed sound: act when the odds were kind, finish quick, and lose no men for pride. Soon a day would come when a flag not lawful by any paper would rise, and faces on another deck would turn hard, and that would be the first true test. The glow of a single lantern by the cabin door set a circle of soft light on the boards most nights, and within that calm, a man could breathe and think about what lay ahead. Sleep came easier when the plan sat clear, even if the plan meant risk. Fear was not a shame when it met a plan that was a lesson worth keeping. The life felt serious but still right, and the crew held to it. When morning came, the ship pointed out to sea, and the path to that first boarding lay waiting in its own good time. Chapter 3. First Boarding. It had begun with a plain morning off New Providence, when a trader showed herself on an easy course, and the talk on the deck turned from small jokes to work. Hornigold kept to his place at the stern and watched, but the task had fallen to the one ready to pass from boy's work to a man's duty, and that meant a first lead at the boarding. A letter of marque still sat in a sea chest, but it had grown thin in the mind as plans grew bold and crews chose their own path. The hands moved to their spots in a practiced way that showed practice, and no grand speech was needed, because men read eyes and knots well enough. The wheel held steady, canvas drew, and the space between hulls closed inch by inch the way a day's work always did. Over the rail, a few faces turned, and then turned away again, for it was not a time for guessing. A comrade beside checked the tie of a scarf, and then nodded once toward the bow, as if to say the moment had come. The smell of tar hung close as a reminder of steady craft, and even with danger ahead, that scent said there were hands here who knew their trade. It was the old way of the sea, that serious times grew out of ordinary ones, and that steadied the heart. You gave a small nod, and the signal crew did what had been agreed the night before, over a simple map scratched on planks. The black flag climbed the line and opened wide, and there was nothing grand in the cloth itself, only the meaning men put into it. On the other deck, work slowed, and figures at their rails stood still as if time had paused, because that sign spoke plain in any tongue. The course was kept steady to ease their minds toward yielding, since a chase and a broken mast helped no one when stores and lives could be saved by sense. The gunner waited on his mark for a line shot across their nose if need be, but no one wanted blood for pride, and that was always the better way when first fortune was measured. A hand beside spoke about shares and the need to keep a crew fed, and the point was true enough for any sea band. A prayer in the head for the souls aboard the prize did no harm, and it kept a man from growing hard, even when gain stood close. The sight of that dark flag above the bright sky fixed the choice in every heart, and it was known that from this point there was no stepping back. That was the way of a first bold step. The beard had grown full over long months, and the trick learned from an older hand came into use at last. Short lengths of slow match were tucked through the whiskers so they would smolder slow and show a picture of dread to a crew that might yet fight. A comrade brought the tinder and gave a small grin that asked for courage more than glory, and you gave a plain nod, because there was not much to say before steel met work. The face set, the mind cleared the way, a lane is swept before a cart, and the plan settled in order. Rope teams first, boarders next, then the men to hold the deck and keep tempers from breaking. The hiss from each bit of match sounded like steam in a kettle, steady and thin, and it warned any bold soul that a close step could mean harm. That sound served as a kind of shield, and it spared men on both sides from foolish charges that would leave widows. Pride stayed tight on a short rope, for the job was not to act like a demon, but to seem like one so that fear worked faster than wounds. It was a hard thing to choose, yet it kept blood from the boards, and that was better for all involved. The merchant did what sense advised and let her canvas slacken, and the space stopped closing as fast while the wheelman steadied his hands. The line crew stood ready with coils to cast, and the men who would hold the rails watched for a clean reach that would not crush a limb. A single shot had been fired as a guide well short of their bow, and that mark had done its work without harm, which was a comfort. Lines went out and caught true, and a pull from both sides brought the rails close enough for work. The deck leader set his stance and raised a hand, and you watched for the right beat. Then he dropped it to time the step from wood to wood, and the trained bodies answered as one. There was a jolt under the boots when the hulls came together, and that shock ran up the bones and said in a blunt way that talk was over. It was not a pretty thing to handle ships at a kiss, but it was part of the craft, and men learned to do it once and then do it better the rest of their lives. Care kept fingers and feet from harm, and care kept tempers even, and that was how a crew stayed whole through a hard day. Simple skill often won more than raw force could. You took the step across with a firm pull on the rail, and the first men made a lane at the edge of the enemy deck while others followed to flood the space. Steel was drawn, and the cutlass in the lead hand swept low and then high to bat aside any reach that came toward the body, not to slice flesh for show, but to keep the way clear to the master of the ship who could order a calm. A young mate on their side tried a brave move with a hook, and he paused for a long blink before sense returned, and his hands dropped away. The path to the rear deck opened, because purpose showed in every step more than rage did. The ring of iron on iron marked the one hard meeting at the rail, sharp and quick, and after that guards lost nerve when they saw that they had been outpaced. Words were used more than blows, and the point of a blade stood as a sign rather than a tool. A call for the captain to stand forth was made plain, and he did so with all the dignity a man could keep on a day like that. Calm was a gift in such moments, and it saved scars that lasted beyond the voyage. The merchant master took the wisdom that kept men alive, and called his hands back from the lines, and the struggle in his face eased when he saw that mercy would be given if reason held. Papers were taken to read names and ports, and account was made of cargo, but it was all done with care, and no chest was cracked in a rush. The crew of the prize were set along the mid-deck under watch and given water, and a promise went out that no harm would touch a man who stayed calm and kept his place. A young sailor from their side tried to boast through fear, and he stopped when he saw the raised hands of his mates mean more than words ever could. The men from our side kept blades low after that first rush, and the captain of the prize stood on his own legs to show that no one had broken him. Shares were spoken of by the man trusted with keeping the count right, and fairness was held forth as the bedrock that held a crew together through thin weeks. The sight of open palms along the rail was the signal that the first hard work had passed, and it reminded every soul that most victories were made by minds, not wounds. That was a good lesson to carry. After the surrender, the day settled into the kind of labor that made a ship run, whether flags were black or white. A small party went below with the merchant master to note the stores and pick out what could be shifted without harm to the ship or to her next voyage. Because a ruined hull helped no man, a prize crew was named and told to steer for a safe creek, and the course was chosen with sandbars and tides in mind more than glory. The rest of the company set to small repairs where lines had strained, and to patch a rail so a boot heel would not catch later and send a man into the sea. When the sun stood past noon, a simple meal was shared from both ships to show that this was trade of a hard kind, not madness. The taste of a dry biscuit worked its way across your tongue, the way truth works through a hard head, slow and plain, and it felt good because it meant the blood had stayed where it belonged. A little rum was measured out but kept tight, and songs were kept for another night, because the work still stood high. Calm order after speed gave the hands rest, and it showed young men what would carry them farther than rage ever could. That was the better part of seamanship. Night drew near with routine still to finish, and the first real fear of that day had already faded into thoughts about rope, water, and roots, which was often how such days ended. The slow match pieces were pinched out and set aside, and the beard went back to being only hair on a tired face, which was a welcome thing. The blade that had cleared a path was wiped and slid back into its place without swagger, because show had never filled a belly. A word was said over the lucky ones and the unlucky ones, in a part of the mind where a man kept his better self, and then the wheelman took his course for the night watches. The lantern light on the planks made soft shapes that asked for rest rather than more daring, and it soothed the prickly thoughts that come after a hard choice. You knew stories would be told of a fierce demon with fire in his beard, but the truth had been steadier than that, shaped by clear orders, firm steps, and a wish to end a fight before it had to begin. There would be other prizes and other long days, and sickness would weigh more than steel on one of them before long, as often happened at sea. For now the crew lay down where they could, and the mind turned to the next dawn with a calm that comes from work done in full. Chapter 4: Taking La Concorde. The hunt had moved south after the first hard taking, with the crew drawing steady lines across the open sea and talking in quiet turns about work, luck, and what might be found. Hornigold was no longer close by, and the men watched for a larger chance that would change the shape of the voyage. There were no speeches, only small orders and the usual checks, which kept minds calm and hands steady. The days went on with plain chores, and the nights passed with small jokes and the same old stories that made worry seem lighter. A prize needed to be worth the strain, and patience earned more than bluster, which was a lesson learned early and kept close. One morning, a lookout called from the high place, and the ship eased a point to bring the sight where it could be loved or feared. A thin smear of sail sat low on the rim of the world, and every gaze bent toward it with a quiet hope. Simple as that moment looked, it held a bend in the road, which is often how fate worked at sea. The crew settled to their places without fuss, for habit had its own comfort, and that was the way of things. Closing in took most of a day, with no rush and no loud show, because hunger for a prize was no excuse to spill blood for nothing. French colours showed on the far ship, and a slack set to her movement hinted at trouble on her decks. Word passed along the line in short notes, and small knots of men checked gear and waited for the call, with no one eager to chase glory that cost limbs. At last the distance grew kind, and a hard choice turned simple, which often happened when calm heads held the deck. A single warning shot went out from the forward cannon, and the echo marked the moment like a bell. Hands eased, because a prize that yielded spared work and grief, and mercy ran cheaper than mourning. A flag of threat was not needed, for the truth of strength could be shown without it. The crew looked to you for the next word, but it came plain and short, as it should in such times. The other ship began to heave to, and the day bent toward a quiet taking, which was a gift not to be wasted. Boats crossed and lines ran, and a cautious climb was made to her rail, with blades low and faces set to business rather than fury. The French captain stood thin, his mouth set in a line that told more than an argument could, and his officers kept close as if bracing their hearts. A few sick men lay apart, and others held their bellies and watched with a dull patience that had no fight in it. No shot was needed, and no bright show was worth the trouble, for the point was gain, not pride. A sour reek drifted up from the close places below, which told of long days, hard work, and the reach of fever. The hold spoke of a trade that broke bodies and souls, and the sight of its marks pulled a quiet anger through the chest, as happens when the cost of coins sits plain before a crew. There were no grand lines then, only the small work of taking stock and keeping men from doing harm out of spite. In that hour, you kept the deck steady and the words level, because strength that showed restraint reached farther than a shout. With the French crew gathered, choices were made that balanced firmness with a clean kind of grace, because a ship did not sail on rage for long. The captain asked for fair terms, and the men around him waited for your nod, as if the weather itself depended on it. Weapons were set aside and counted, not to shame but to keep the peace and hold the line that held everyone safe. A smaller vessel from your company stood ready to carry these men away, along with the few who wished to join, for there was always someone who chose a different flag when luck turned. Rations were passed in measured hands, for kindness done while the sun watched was a strength of its own. The biscuit given over tasted dusty on the tongue, and it reminded all present that hunger humbled even the proud. A ship's surgeon was asked to stay, for skill mattered more than flags when bones and breath needed care. It was not a day for laughter, but it was not a day for cruelty either, and that balance was the difference between a crew and a mob. Once the prize was held simple and sure, work began to shape her into something new, because a ship did not become a home until hands made it so. The French name La Concorde stayed on the stern for a short hour, which was the time needed to lay plans and weigh the shape of the hull against the needs of the coming days. Then the word went out to scrape, mend, and ready, and men set to with quiet duty that always put a keel back in order. A carpenter looked over the rails and counted spots that begged for care, while gunners tested lines where a swivel gun might stand and talk when talk was needed. The renaming was a thing done with thought and not a crowd's noise, because names carried weight and told others what to expect. When the time came, black tar shone on the planks as if a seal had been pressed, and new letters began to take their place. Queen Anne's revenge was spoken aloud, not to stir fear, but to set a past and a purpose in one line. It fit the crew's temper, and gave the ship a soul, which is what every hull needs. Days ran into one another, as hard work turned the prize into a flagship, and the men found a rhythm that kept blame away. The hull was hauled over as far as the cords would allow, and scrapers did their honest duty while a watch kept eyes on the horizon. The tall masts took new lines, and canvas was checked for weak spots that might betray a crew at the wrong hour. Small teams shifted gear to better places, because a heavy ship needed sense as much as strength to answer the helm in a pinch. Gunners were set to their stations and drilled in slow, steady steps, so that every move felt like a habit rather than a guess. The scrape of blades under the waterline set a simple beat for the crews above, and the sound held men together in a way no speech ever could. Order took root without fuss, and jokes returned when backs warmed and sore hands began to trust the shape of the work. A strong deck and a fair share kept tempers calm, and that was the steady truth of life at sea. In a quiet hour, the naming was sealed for good, with paint and a word that reached past the deck to memory, as if a hand had been laid on an old scar. The crew stood in easy rows while a man with a brush knelt to his task, and no one spoke except to say the name once in a low voice that carried just enough. Queen Anne had been the distant shield for many who had taken ships when a different war still held the sea, and there was a kind of loyalty in the sound, even if the crown had changed since. Revenge in the name was not a call to madness, but a simple way to say the old fights still counted in a world that forgot its promises. The letters on the stern caught the light as they dried, and they looked plain and strong against the dark coat. Some men smiled, some crossed themselves, and some stared out at the blue, as if trying to see the next trial. Names did not win fights, but they steadied hearts, and that was worth more than bragging. When canvas finally drew, and the new flagship came alive under a sure hand, the crew felt the change without a word, which was the best sign of all. She was heavier than the small craft that had carried the crew so far, and she needed patience in a turn and a long view when threading a tricky line. But she owned the sea in a way a lesser hull never could. Drill followed drill, and the men learned to time their steps to the new pace, while watches ran longer to keep this larger deck safe from trouble. A few small prizes were taken to test the spread of the guns, and the word went down the lanes that a fresh power had come looking. Charts were studied without fuss, and the names of bars and inlets were said in quiet talks so that every man knew what thread would be walked next. The wheel pulled steady under the hands, and that weight felt like a promise rather than a burden. You looked over the crew and saw a shape taking hold, one bent towards something large and careful. The course set north to test a narrow bar later, but for now the ship held even, and the day ended with calm hearts. Chapter 5. The Charleston Bar. In May of 1718, the choice was made to lay a hand across the mouth of Charleston. The bar was tricky, with breaks and channels, but a mind that knew water could use that. Orders went out, and the sloops took their marks so no hull could slip by without a word from the center ship. Queen Anne's Revenge sat in the deep cut, and the lighter craft guarded the shoals so that both bold captains and careful ones would be checked. Soundings were kept, anchors were walked out, and signals were set so each crew knew what to do when a mast showed on the horizon. A man who had learned patience knew this was not a storming sort of work. It was a fence made of tide and timber. A blockade looked simple from the beach, but it took quiet nerve. You set it like a net and let it do the work. A steady wind pressed the canvas, and that was enough to keep the line firm. In time, a first merchant sail came on, and the plan moved from words to practice. That was the way of things. The first ship tried to nose out with the morning flood, thinking to catch slack hands after a long night. A flag went up to show no one would pass without leave, and a warning shot went wide to take sense over pride. There was no need for fury when a clean show would do. The merchant captain saw the line, saw the armed hull in the cut, and let his helm fall over. A longboat left the center ship, and men with steady faces climbed the stranger's side. Their speech stayed even and plain. There was nobody eager for waste. Papers were looked over, the course was checked, and the goods were marked for hold until matters were settled. You had charged them to take care and keep order, no more. It was a slow way to make a point, but it worked, and it hurt no one who kept a clear head. A single gun boomed, and that was enough for the harbor to understand. That was the way of things. Passengers were brought aboard as surety, not as trophies, and promises were made with calm words. Men were put under guard, not to frighten them, but to keep them safe while demands went forward. The need was simple. Fever had run through crews since winter. Wounds had grown foul, and clean medicine had to be had. Not gold this time, not rum, not powder. A chest of remedies would do more than any heap of coins. You spoke plain to the chosen men, told them the terms, and sent the message ashore. The crew kept watch and minded their tasks, and the boarded ship was eased within the line so no harm would find her. Pride had to be held on a short rope, or it would run wild. The pitch was tacky underfoot, and it held a print like a reminder that men left marks wherever they stood. That was the way of things. A boat with 2 hands and a hostage pushed for the town with a letter that laid out the need. The line held steady while they went. The tide made and fell, and hours turned long. Councilmen in the town weighed pride and fear, and the boat did not come back when it was due. Tempers on the line had to be kept easy. Crews were told to sit their stations, to watch their angles, and to let the blockade work. Each new sail was taken in hand the same way to show the rule would not bend until the chest came out. The aim was not a crown, but a cure. That sort of demand made more sense to common men and to masters, and it kept the lid on open rage. The tide hissed along the hull, and patience held even when eyes went to the roadstead and saw nothing change. That was the way of things. Days of waiting put a weight on backs, and small habits kept the ship right. Water was shared with care, lines were checked, and work was rotated so no temper ran sharp. When another merchant came on, the same steps were taken, and no insult was added to the act. Plain food was given to the hostages, and a man with a steady voice told them the demand again. This was a lever, not a grudge. Crews kept to the chores that made a deck ready, and each afternoon a quiet word reminded men why the blockade mattered. To starve a town would have turned every hand against the line, but to hold a gate for a fair cause was another thing. That was the lesson that had been learned before, and it served here too. The sun beat hot on backs, and the work went on in even strokes, like an oar carried from hand to hand. That was the way of things. When the town delayed more, a time was set and word was sent that the line would tighten. If the boat did not return by the turn of the glass, ships would be set aflame and prisoners sent to their fate. It was a hard promise, but it was the only thing that moved officials who thought they could wait it out. Guns were run out and crews were placed, boarding parties were picked, and charges were kept ready to fire prizes if it came to that. The channel was measured in angles, so no vessel could bolt without taking shot. You set the deadline and stood to it, so the threat would be believed, not to boast, but to give the town a clean choice. Men stood quiet at their stations, and they knew what would come if word did not arrive. The slow match tips glowed red, and time thinned to a narrow line. That was the way of things. Before the last measure of time was up, the town boat showed at last, and pulled for the line with a chest under a canvas. The faces inside that boat did not need to be told twice to come on. The crew took the chest aboard, opened it long enough to see that it held what was named, and sent the word to ease the line. Hostages were brought up and told to go home without a mark on them, and the prizes were set loose to find safe water. Adventure shifted to cover the turn, and the main ship moved to lift her hooks and stand out from the bar. No cheer ran down the decks and no swagger was shown. The point had been made, and the need had been met. You let go of the hold you had kept and watched the channel clear at last. The chest thumped on the planks, and the work turned from threat to care. That was the way of things. By dusk, the blockade had done its work, and ended without a broad slaughter, which was the mark of a captain who knew when enough was enough. The name that would grow later in taverns rested on days like this, as much as on roaring fights. Power was not only in shot and blade, but in steady use of tide and line, and a clear demand that could be met. Men talked afterward, as men do, and the story grew taller, but it had been plain labor and cold choice at the heart. There would be days ahead when flags would be used to trick a target close, and when fire would answer fire, because the sea pushed life that way. For now, the bar fell behind as the ships stood off to look for other chances and other needs. A cool breeze eased across faces, and the night was simple in its turn. That was the way of things. Chapter 6: False Colors and Fire. The sea lay open after Charleston, and the great hull moved with the slow pride of a ship that had held a bar and would not be hurried now. A lookout called a sail off the bow, and the glass showed a broad merchant built for fat cargo, not speed. The plan formed with the same steady shape it always took: a friendly flag first, a quiet approach, and a show of heart only when the range turned honest. Men knew their parts without fuss, because habit kept order, even when luck ruled the rest. Orders passed in low voices, and the wheel took a small turn to match the stranger's line. The crew checked lines, cleared paths for the guns, and kept faces plain. It was work, nothing more, though danger hid inside it like a nail inside a board. Hearts did not bang around the ribs anymore. Practice had worn the nerves smooth, and that helped a man think. A hand brushed the rail, as if to greet an old friend. For wood had a way of being steady when a person needed it to be steady. There was no hurry, only planning and drift. And out there ahead, the sail looked like a neat white triangle against the sky, as if someone had sketched it with a clean cut of chalk. That was the way of the sea. A simple mark could mean a day's bread or a day's blood. A fair flag rose to the gaff, the one that said friend in the tongue most ships knew, and the stranger kept on without alarm. The helm answered gently to bring the bows closer, while men moved like shop hands getting ready to close the door for the night. Tools were set within reach but covered by spare cloth, and heavy items were braced so they would not shift when the time came. A few jokes passed, soft and flat, and a nod here and there held the crew together better than any hard speech could do. The long game had patience built into it, because a closing run needed straight lines and brave faces. A captain near the wheel kept his voice even, asking for one point then another, as the gap began to shrink like a mouth that was done with talk. The stranger might yet take the hint and turn, but today it seemed dull and busy, and not ready to think. So the ship pressed on, and kept the false peace at the masthead. The warmth of the sun lay on the back of the neck, steady and calm, as if the day itself gave its consent. That easy heat had a way of saying that a man could do his work and trust the hour to hold. At pistol-shot distance, though no one said it out loud, the glass showed bright paint, tired lines, and sailors who watched but did not guess. The mate set the signal for a hail, and a polite word ran from rail to rail, sent across like a handshake no one wanted to grip too soon. Then, at the nod, the friendly cloth slid down. In the same breath, a black face climbed the halyard and broke free at the peak. The Jolly Roger showed teeth to the morning, and the stranger stalled as if a hand had pressed hard on its heart. That change had a rhythm the crew knew, a pause that turned waiting men into moving men. The bows yawed a finger, left to take a better line for the guns. The men at the tackles readied their weight. The stranger's captain must have felt the truth settle, for a few bodies ran to their work as if the deck had grown hot stones. But by then the measure had been called, and it could not be unsung. Cloth cracked above like a slap when the black flag met the wind, a hard sound that always made the next moment very clear. Fear had its place, but habit had a stronger one. That was the way of it. The first gun captain pointed with his whole body, and the crews ran their iron mouths out until the muzzles kissed air. The command came plain and short, the only kind that works when time is short. Aim low, roll her, fire. The broadside struck with tight timing, the sort drilled on slow days when rain kept men under the awning and a captain kept their hands busy. Planks shuddered in answer, and splinters jumped where the balls found their bite. The space between ships went bright for a blink, then turned back into work again. This was not fury so much as craft. Good crews did not waste shot or breath. Between guns, heavy men drew on ropes to run the pieces in, sponged, charged, rammed, and thrust them out again. The stranger tried to swing away, but the wheel held steady on this side, and the line closed the way a slow door closes when the latch is sure. The deck jumped under your feet when the broadside let go, an upward thud that said both power and risk at once. It was the old grip of the ship on the body, and it reminded a person that wood and iron could move even the heaviest thought. The range kept shrinking, and so the small pieces came into play, where angles got tight and clean shots counted most. A swivel gun on the quarter spat at the rail, across the gap, first to sweep the men who dared show themselves, then to worry the helm. The starboard crews loaded quick, and sent their work tight and mean, one gun after another, each man keeping his part as if he were a wheel tooth turning fine. Lines parted on the stranger, and cloth sagged, and a spar settled like a tired arm. A few return balls punched the sea wide of the mark, and died with a short life, which was the best fate for them. Hands with pikes kept low, and waited for the next call, which was to hold fire and make ready to board. That order always made time slow down, as if the next step needed the world to breathe once more. The stranger's captain waved for mercy, and then waved for fight, which said he had not made up his mind. Calm settled in the mind here, not in the heart, because choice lived in the next yard of water. A steady ringing sat in the ears from the last crash of guns, a thin edge that made silence feel far away. That was the cost of the trade, and men paid it without drama. The bows came together enough for thrown iron to catch, and grapnels bit into the other rail while bodies leaned back to hold the line. A few men crossed first with blades kept low and faces kept blank, not for show but because habit saved strength. Others followed with short, hard steps, giving no room for doubt. The stranger's crew tried to push them off, but weight and will went the other way. A calm voice called for no waste and no rage, and that did more than any shout. Hands worked past barrels and coils, finding a path straight to the quarterdeck where decisions lived. A mate from the other side made a stand, then let his arm drop when he saw no gap to run through. A few more men added themselves to the pile of giving up, and the rest took the hint. The flag at their peak slid down with a rough pull, and that was that. Across the planks there was the taste of iron and salt on the tongue, a thin bite that sat there while the breath came back. A plain end was always better than a wild one, and everyone knew it. After the taking came the long part, because a capture was only half a job. Wounded men were laid out where air could reach them, and clean cloth went to the worst cuts first, with a word or two that kept the mind steady. Prisoners were set aside under guard, given water, and told the truth of their day in a voice that did not mock. Cargo was tallied quick to learn if the risk had been fair, though no one said the numbers out loud near the prisoners. The best hands had learned to look for tricks, false bottoms, and clever lids, because a hold could lie as easily as a man could lie. Even then, care was taken not to break what might buy bread. A few questions were asked of the stranger's master, who gave them up easy once he could see that life was the only prize he could still own. The talk stayed level and quiet, because rage wasted time and stained the deck for no gain. Powder drift hung in the air with its sour edge, a reminder that thunder had walked across the planks not long ago. The smell always told its own tale. Work followed until it faded, because that was the order of things. Toward evening, the ships eased apart, and lines were cast back with a last check for anything worth keeping or giving. The prize crew took their place with care, and the main deck here was washed down with patient strokes to send the day's marks into the wake. A small share passed to the prisoners for food, not out of softness, but because peace was easier that way. A reckoning with charts and rumors began, since a big storm had been rising in the talk of governors. There were hints of letters and pardons and traps hidden inside favors. A man did not have to like the game to see the board. The master spoke of creeks and quiet towns upriver, where papers might wash stains from names at least for a while. Some faces brightened at that, and others went blank, both fair ways to think on it. No one promised more than a fair try. Night drew in as the watch was set, and the glass turned. The soft wash of water along the hull kept time with the ship's slow breath, a hush that rolled and rolled without end. It said there would be another day, and that calm had its own kind of strength. Chapter 7. A Pardon in Bath. In Bath, Bath town sat back from the wide water, a scatter of roofs behind trees and a few paths running down to the creek, and the place felt smaller than any tales said it would be. After so much push and show, it was a simple landing, and that suited a man who had been too long at work. The crew spoke in low voices about farms and shops in a stretch of quiet, and no one bragged, for even a loud story needs a soft start when the stakes are high. You had come for a paper that promised a clean slate, and there was sense in that after bold weeks under dark flags. The ship lay out where the mud ran deep, and a boat carried a few ashore to make the case and ask the terms. The men who stayed behind watched the bank and waited, as hands do when they hope for peace, yet do not trust it. Folklore makes a monster of a man, but a day like that showed only patience and the wish to set down weight. The first steps felt steady, and that was enough to ease a guard. The only sound that marked the choice was the soft slap of creek water under the pier, which seemed to say that calm was possible if a man gave it room, and that was the way of things. Governor Charles Eden had a careful look about him, not harsh, not weak, and he seemed to know that a paper alone could not fix a man's course, yet he offered what the king had set out. You stood in a small room where 2 chairs, a table, and a few papers made the business plain, and no one raised a fuss because quiet talk was safer than grand show. A clerk wrote the words and set down the name, and Eden spoke the oath as if it were a simple order for the road ahead. You said the words back, promised fair conduct, and let the past sit behind you at least for the day. A few of the men did the same, while others waited, and there was no rush to judge, because every sailor knows that change comes slow. The paper felt light in the hand, almost nothing at all, yet it carried weight because men agreed to honor it. Some say it was all a game, but a man can try a new path even if he keeps one eye on the old one. The moment passed without drama, marked only by the scratch of the quill as it moved across the page, a small sound that spoke of order trying to hold, and that was the way of things. Life in Bath had a steady pace once the oath was taken, and the crew kept to the creeks while days found simple work. A few lines were mended, a hull scoured of weeds, and small errands were done for folks on the bank who cared more for fence rails and hog pens than sea stories. You walked a short street that held a shop, a shed, and 1 tavern, and it seemed a place where the world paused between storms. A man who had been a terror at sea could pass as a neighbor if he nodded at the right times and did not stir old talk. The beard made a mark, but the face under it was just a face, and a plain coat hid any edge. Men who had followed you watched their pay and their drink, and they learned to be easy with townsfolk because hard looks bring trouble. You felt the change and weighed it, knowing that peace can sit in a man's lap and still not belong to him. There was a sense that the tide had turned, yet tide turns back, and any sailor knows it. The sun warmed the porch rail outside the tavern, A quiet heat on the wood that said a man could rest his hands without fear for a while, and that was the way of things. A neighbor asked you in for a bite, late one day, and the table held salt pork and ship biscuit with a small cup beside, which was more kindness than you had seen from strangers in months. The man spoke of a fence that sagged and a sow that would not mind, and you listened as if such matters were the most pressing business on earth. A woman came and went with a calm face, and a child peered in but said nothing, which felt fair because fame can make a child wary. Your name did not carry the sharp edge it carried at sea, and that showed how land can soften a line. You told a short tale about storms and luck, leaving out the parts that would have set the room on edge because there was no need to stir the pot. The neighbor offered news of crops and the price of a barrel, and you nodded, finding sense in the small things that keep a place running. Folks can handle a past if the present is polite, and that was the thought you took with you when you rose. Pine smoke hung in the room and clung to your beard as you thanked them, a homely scent that made the moment feel honest, and that was the way of things. Nights in Bath brought easy talk, and the tavern kept a seat for any man with coin and good manners, which your crew tried to show. There were songs that spoke of kings and wives and poor luck, and some verses that turned your old deeds into jest, which is better than hate once the cups are low. You learned which settlers liked a story and which wanted quiet, and you gave each what they wished because that buys peace. Eden's paper stayed tucked away, more charm than shield, yet it kept tempers cool when a stranger asked blunt questions. A few hands joked about land, saying they might plant corn, though you could hear the sea in their words no matter how they shaped them. It was strange to be welcome and watched at once, but that is how small towns deal with sudden fame. A man can stand the gaze if he keeps his voice soft and his steps small, and you did that because the time called for it. The clink of a mug on the table made a small ring like a bell and settled the room into a slow, steady mood that fit the promise of the paper, and that was the way of things. There were small runs along the creeks after that. Nothing loud, just tidy trips at dawn when the light lay thin and work could be done without a stir. Goods were fetched from a stranded hull down the coast, and papers were shown to make it plain there was leave for it, which eased the minds that needed easing. You kept the crews small, chose men who could keep talk short, and made sure no one waved a sign that would raise old flags. Money moved as it always does, by quiet hands and careful faces, and the town kept its calm, because calm is a treasure too. Some said the whole thing was a trick to wash a name while keeping it sharp, and some said a man had earned his rest, and both views had pieces of the truth. You watched the shore grow familiar, and the channels map themselves in memory, and that kind of knowing puts a man at ease. Still, there was a twitch in the gut that told of eyes on the horizon, and a wise man hears it. A thin mist lay along the creek and hid the far bank as boats came and went, a pale veil that made each move seem gentler than it was, and that was the way of things. Word traveled whether a man wished it or not, and soon talk came of navy sloops poking at inlets and officers eager to prove their worth, which meant the quiet would not hold forever. Some planters grew nervous when a rough face turned up near a barn, while others offered a nod and kept their counsel, and both kinds were easy to understand. You kept the crew trimmed to steady men, and sent those with quick tempers off to find other work, because a sharp tongue starts more fires than it puts out. Eden held his line, calm as before, and there were days when the town felt safe enough to call this a fresh start. Even so, a man who has made a storm knows how to count clouds, and the sky had that look of weather beyond the capes. The boys told jokes to ease the weight, and you laughed with them, willing to let hope run a little ahead. If a test would come, it would come from the water, for that was where fate had always found you. Palmetto fronds rustled outside the house just enough to show the breeze was alive, a dry whisper that hinted at change without fear, and that was the way of things. By late season, the crew favored the broad sound again, a bend of water that had served as haven before, and the pull of the inlets was like a rope tied to old habit. Ocracoke offered a snug corner and a clear run for any move that might be needed, and men who had sat quiet too long found strength in the return to tide and sand. You did not rush it, for speed gets a man noticed when he most wants to blend into the reeds, and patience had bought this much peace already. A few last calls were made in Bath, hands were shaken, and faces were put into memory in case the road back ran long. Eden's paper stayed close, though not even a governor can reach across a gunwale once tempers flare, and every man knew it. Hope held steady all the same, because hope is a sailor's best tool when charts run thin. Fate would do as it pleased, but a steady heart and clear eyes could meet it fair, and that was enough. The lantern flame in the small cabin held steady in the still night, as plans were laid for the anchorage to come. A quiet light that promised order for one more turn of the tide, and that was the way of things. Chapter 8, Maynard at Ocracoke. Dawn had come light and slow over Ocracoke Inlet, and two slim navy sloops slid in from the open sea, with bare decks that told more than they hid. The inlet had always been a friend, with its bars and crooked cuts, but a friend could be fickle when strangers learned the turns. Anchors had held through the night, and the crew had spoken in low words about the shallow water and the run of the tide, each man thinking of the pardon and the quiet days that had not lasted. It was known that soldiers and governors liked to make an end of bold names, and a man with a bold name had to expect a morning like this sooner or later. A small kedge lay ready off the stern, and lines were coiled neat so there would be no stumble when things began. Men showed their faces on the navy decks, just enough to tease a guess about numbers, while the rest stayed out of sight, which said plenty about the plan they carried. A few on our side smiled at that, because tricks were fair in this work, and tricks could cut both ways. The sky held a thin pale band above the dunes, and that strip of color looked like a clean line across a map. There was no panic in it, only the steady sense that a choice had met its time, and that was the way of things. Orders had gone out in even tones, and men had checked pistols and blades with the same care used to mend a sail or set a net. A name had weight on a deck, but the work was the same as always. One hand checking a strap, another hand feeling the heft of a tool, and a third tying a line so it would run smooth. A few old scores were noted with a nod, and a few jokes ran down the rail, simple and plain the way mornings at anchorage often were. The creek mouths along the banks had gone quiet with the light, and the marsh held its shape like a wall of grass. No one forgot the letter once signed in Bath, or the days in creeks when life felt soft and slow, yet no one thought that paper would guard a ship now. The small crew had grit, and a man learned that grit counted more than talk when boards began to shake. Fingers brushed the lock on a flintlock, and the metal smelled faintly of the oil rubbed in the night before. The inlet's crooked ways had taught many lessons about patience, and patience had a place even when steel waited near at hand. Calm held the group together as a steady habit, because calm could carry a man farther than anger. When the Navy sloops drew near, cables were cut clean, and the helm was put over to make for a narrow run where their drafts would lose nerve. The banks on either side looked close enough to touch, and the sandbars showed in patches that could snare or save, depending on a turn of luck and a steady hand. The sloop moved forward with a hard push on the capstan, and the sail took enough wind to slide her past the shoal. A first blast tore across the water from our side, and men on their decks ducked behind the rail while a few fell still. There was no joy in it, only the math of trouble put off for a minute, and in that minute more choices had to be made. The first sloop lagged, and the second kept coming in a brave line, its captain trying to draw closer without giving away his trick. It seemed clear that many had gone down, which was the story wished for in times like this, though wishes were thin. Powder smoke curled in the still air and set a grey curtain between hulls. A hand touched the rail the way a man might pat a horse before a jump. One last promise to a craft that had shared much. Plans felt tight and simple, which was how they needed to be. The moment came to close and make an end in single blows, not in long guessing. Grapnels were thrown, and boards met boards with a scrape that said the gap between lives had gone to nothing. Faces could be read at arm's length now, and each face carried its own reasons for being there. A shout rose for a rush, and boots took the leap from home to enemy, which was the oldest step on water. The first men over swung with purpose, and the next men followed in a steady stream that had its own rhythm. A shape in a plain coat moved at the front on their side, firm and ready, and a nod passed along our line. A heavy tool fit in the hand like an old friend, a boarding axe raised to clear the way without talk. There had been many mornings like this in smaller fights, and those mornings had taught that the first few breaths often decided the hour. The deck underfoot felt the rough bite of splinters through worn soles. In close work, a man trusted his limbs more than any plan, and that trust had kept bodies whole before. Duty, In that moment was a short word that meant keeping men beside from harm as best as possible. At first it looked clean enough, with only a thin line of sailors in front of us, braced and set as if the rest had run. A few fell back in a show that said fear, and the gap called for another push. Then trapdoors flew up as one, and a crowd came roaring up from the hold with pistols and pikes ready, their timing neat and sharp, that told what their captain had chosen. And it was a smart choice, the kind that turned a hope into a hard thing. The crew kept shape, and the line bent instead of breaking, which was all that could be asked. A pistol flash took the hat brim off a man at the elbow, and another shot grazed a shoulder, but the rush still held. The leap that had seemed a step into a quiet end became a struggle that bit back, and that was a lesson learned again for the last time. The axes and blades went to work at arm's length, where names counted less than nerve. Faces that had been far away at dawn now showed close, every line plain. The sight of a sudden press of pale faces rising from below felt like a wall coming up from the deck itself. It was a bitter trick, but it was a fair one at sea, and fairness had many shapes. Through the crush came a tall officer with a plain sword and a set jaw, and the two of you met without ceremony, as men did when 1 hour decided a year. He moved well, and there was no waste in him, only steady steps and a clear eye. Steel struck steel, and the ring of it marked a small circle where other men could not help. He slipped a cut past a guard, and took a line across the ribs, and a reply drove his point back. A pistol fired too near, and the coat smoked where a spark had kissed it, while the arm still held strength. The men around saw a narrow space open and close again, and each tried to pull it wider for his side. Names were shouted, and some were the names of wives or children, which told the truth of why men stood where they stood. The blade grew heavy, and each swing cost more than the one before. Yet cost had never made the choice in this life. A chip from a fallen spar skidded underfoot, and spoiled a stance that had always been sound. The taste of blood touched the tongue, and felt metallic and thin. A man did not choose the shape of his last stand, but he could choose its steadiness. The press tightened around the small knot at the center, and the crew on our side grew fewer as the hour stretched thin. A few tried to pull back to the rail to make room to breathe, and a few slipped over to the boat to draw fire away, each act done with a quick nod. The Navy men had numbers, and their plan had worked, and nothing more needed saying about that. A hand reached to throw down a line to a comrade, and the line fell short by half a yard, which felt like a map of the morning. The officer stepped in again, and a blow cut the hat lanyard and let the brim fall and roll away like a wheel with no axle. The deck ran with footprints that told stories no one would ever hear spoken. Old tales about a demon beard and burning fuses sounded thin, now beside plain sweat and steady hands. The water slapped the hull in a slow beat, a soft pulse that had kept all men company since the first dugout. The fight had boiled to a size that matched a single span of arms, and that was how most grand stories truly ended. There was no shame in it, only the closing of a road walked hard. Steel and tackle and men made a tight pattern in the last minutes, and every move grew simple again, as if the years had unrolled back to the first brawl in a harbour tavern. A few last shots cracked from close in, and then it was hands and blades, and the world shrank to a length not much longer than a berth. A mate at the shoulder gave a push to clear a path, and a reply landed on his forearm that bent him down. The officer came on with a careful step, and a second man tried to flank with a short blade, and it was met best it could be met. There were thoughts of Nassau and Bath and the long run between, yet those thoughts did not slow the arm or the knee. The crew had held together as far as men could, and a man could not ask more from fellows who had eaten the same biscuit and shared the same jokes in dark watches. A hand found the rail and felt for a tighter grip that was not there. The sound of the bay's small chop reached the ear as a steady tap against the planks. Pride thinned into plain, stubborn life, and even that had its end. There was calm in knowing that nothing had been left undone that could have been done. Chapter 9. After the clash, morning at Ocracoke settled in after the rush, and the last shouts faded into plain orders. You had fallen in that fight, and men who had stood close a moment before now stepped back because time had moved on, and other duties called. The lieutenant gathered his people and set guards, and a few hands dragged gear into piles to be counted later. Some of the crew slipped into the marsh and were taken when they tried to hide, and some just sat down where they were and stared at nothing, because shock often made choices for men. A comrade beside had a cut on his arm and asked a boy for a strip of cloth, and the boy did as he was told because that was how rank worked. Even on a small boat after a hard morning, the small waves slapped the hull. A few faces on the shore watched for a while and then turned away to their homes, which was not cruel so much as the normal pull of chores and food and family. In the end, it all came down to people doing the next thing in front of them, even after a name was ended, and that was the way of endings at sea. By noon, the lieutenant gave the order that sealed the lesson the Navy wanted to send north along the coast. The head was taken and set at the bowsprit, and the body was let go to the water because that was the custom, when a warning was needed and space was tight. It hung there as a dark shape, blunt and plain to any ship they met on the run to Virginia. A sailor tied the last knot and stepped back, and another man crossed himself, and another spat, which showed how different minds found their own ways to square the moment. A few of your men stood nearby with wrists bound and stared at the deck, not at the shape above, because a man's eyes often chose the smaller thing he could handle. No one said much. Orders moved the work along because work always moved, even on a day like that. The message was set, and the boat pointed north because time did not pause for grief. The sail was trimmed for the run up the coast, and watches went on without fuss because the Navy liked its days in neat rows. The lieutenant kept his voice level and calm when he spoke, and the helmsman held his course as if the morning's clash were no more than a squall that had passed. Rations were counted. The prize crew kept a steady eye on the prisoners, and the midshipman wrote a few lines in a book, not because he loved writing, but because that was his job. A deckhand patched a rent and did not look up when someone asked him if he was tired, since tired or not, work was work. The timbers creaked. A man who had never been far from home asked an older hand about shawls, and the older hand answered, slow and sure, as if talking about fields and fences. The head stayed where it was, and the men stayed at their tasks, and the day moved by in the usual steps, which was how crews kept fear small enough to carry. They reached Virginia water and turned for Hampton, where the law liked things done in daylight and in front of people. The boat slowed near the river's edge, and a group on the bank gathered because news moved faster than a keel when it carried a story. Some of them knew a neighbor who had lost a cousin to a raid last year, and some only wanted to see a thing that would give them bold talk at supper, and that mixture told the truth about towns. The smell of river mud sat over the landing. The lieutenant's men stood straight because they knew eyes were on them, and the prisoners shuffled when told because there was no use in making a show against a rope and a sword. An officer took measured steps ashore, and another man pointed at the head and explained in short words what had been done. It was not pageantry, it was a chore with a message. That was how power worked, along a coast where the tide set the pace as much as any bell. From there, the path went on, in the way of courts and cells, which followed their own slow tide. The bound men were counted and moved, first to a room near the water, and then inland when papers were ready, because paper always found its place in these matters. Weeks turned into months before the trials, which was the habit then, and some of the men talked and named names to shorten the rope, and some kept their mouths tight because that was the only pride they had left. A clerk asked the same questions in the same order, and a judge asked them again, and the jurors listened because that was what they were told to do. The clink of chains marked the hours. A few were cleared for one reason or another, others were condemned, and the day for hanging came on like any other day, which might seem harsh, but was simply the pace of life. A chaplain spoke from a book, and a low prayer passed over a few lips, and then it ended, the way such things ended in port towns where fields needed tending and boats needed mending. Back in Bath and along the shallow creeks, people spoke of what had happened, and then moved to other talk, because harvests and fish runs did not wait. A neighbor remembered a loan settled after the pardon, and said it fair, and another neighbor mentioned a time a keg had been shared, and that was the balance folks held, when a name was on everyone's tongue. In taverns, men told the story with hands and elbows as if they had been there themselves, and someone always asked if the beard had truly scared men stiff, which brought a nod or a shrug depending on the mood. A rusty cutlass on a nail in a shed drew a glance from time to time, more as a memory than a threat. The taste of weak ale sat on lips during those talks. A child leaned in to listen and was told to finish a chore first, because homes had their own small laws that did not care about big names. In the end, chores were done, and the stories waited until the evening when the lamps were lit in the usual way. Down the line in other ports, The story grew taller the farther it sailed, which was the normal way of sea tales. Some said matches had burned in the beard all day and never gone out, and some swore the man had sworn he would never be taken, and others said he had laughed on the last morning, which told more about the tellers than the truth. The men who had sailed under him knew the grind behind the show, but they kept their words short because saying too much brought questions, and questions brought trouble. A few songs were made, simple and rough, and they travelled with men looking for work, and soon a boy in a far town had the tune and did not know where it started. A candle flickered in a back room, while a talk went on about tide sense and nerve and simple luck. It was not all brag, some of it was a way to put fear behind and make it small. A name grew larger in that sort of light, which was how legends found their legs. The sea kept its easy roll, while days lined up behind the fight, and nothing in the water cared who had ruled a channel for a season. The head on the run to Virginia was taken down at last, and the body had long been part of the deep, and the men who had cheered or cursed that morning went on to other work because a living had to be made. Your name stayed on the wind in a way that surprised no one who had watched the rise of it, and yet the real share for most people was smaller. A memory of a voice, a missing coin, a tale for a winter night. The low hush of surf lay under the talk. There was comfort in that sound, steady and even, as if the world itself promised that hot moments cooled, and that the tide would always bring the next morning. So the story of the man of the beard moved past the last clash and into the long run of telling, ready for the way talk and truth would wrestle over it in the years ahead. Chapter 10. Name and Legend. In the years after the inlet fight, a story walked from one shore to the next and took its seat at rough tables as if it paid for the room. Men spoke of a giant who ruled the sea, and women leaned in with steady eyes, and a lad fetched another mug when the telling ran long. The air smelled of ale, and that one plain scent tied the boasting to the floor. The tale grew teeth because it was easier to speak of a monster than a sailor who worked hard and took chances. Memory liked a bold edge more than a slow, stubborn line. It was said the beard alone could turn brave men pale, and that flame danced there, and that sailors begged for mercy with a look. There was comfort in the telling, because fear felt smaller once it had a face. A person could nod and say, "That is the kind of man who did those things," and then go back to sweeping a step. That was the way of things. From port to port, the pattern held. A survivor swore he saw a grin through a roll of smoke, and a clerk wrote neat words in a book, and a captain who never met the man told a friend he had seen the flags for real. The name Edward Teach sat heavy on tongues, because a hard name made the next watch seem less dull. A small scrape of a chair across a plank floor marked the moment when the voice in the corner took hold of a room. In that pause, the facts bent a little, and then a little more, so that fright fit the mouth that spoke it. A pistol became two, a warning shot became a storm, and a hard bargain became a cruel oath. No one stood up to argue, because no one wanted the air to go flat. People wished to be carried along, and so the line between show and truth slid. That was the way of talk. The part about fire in the beard grew larger than any other piece, though the real trick had been simple. Smouldering cords had been tucked in tight, where a spark could frighten without burning skin, and thin smoke curled in the dawn so that a foe paused at the sight. It steadied nerves on one deck and shook them on another, which is what a leader wanted when men were close and the work ahead was sharp. In later rooms, the cords turned to bright flames lapping at a smile, and folks swore that sparks dropped on the boards and lit the dark. The truth did not change because a tale stretched it. It had been a way to mark a moment and to push chance a little. There was nothing grand in it, only care and nerve. A body did what it had to do when each breath might be the last. That was the craft of it. The blockade story also grew its own sails. People said the city had been choked and no boat dared move, and the talk of a medicine chest became a curse thrown at the shore. On the decks where the plan had been made, the choice felt narrow. Sickness had sat low in bellies, and fever had taken men who had done nothing worse than stand their watch. Fear moved in both directions, and a show of strength turned the tide without a shot. The feel of wind on a cheek had been the simple sign that time ran short, and that the pass must be held only so long as the point was made. Later, it was told like a raid on heaven. In truth, it had been a bluff and a bargain to keep men alive. The city had its pride, the ships had their masters, and both sides still wanted to meet another dawn. That was how need talked. Most days had not been gun and charge. They had been tide checks, coil checks, and hands on wet work. Bread had been shared without a word, and a joke had been told to soften a hard order. A purse had been counted with care, and a man had learned to look at the sky more than his boots. The rough drag of hemp across a palm had been a teacher when the seas ran heavy and a spar needed to hold. When stories later raced around tables, this steady part sat quiet because nobody paid to hear about tar under nails or a split finger wrapped in cloth. Yet that grind had been the root of everything that followed. It trained a body to move without fuss and gave a crew a shape that could bend but not break. A life like that did not shine, but it kept a ship afloat. That was the truth beneath the paint. There was another side the ballads never liked. After a paper had been taken and a promise given, there were creeks with low banks and cabins with small rooms. A neighbor shared fish and plain bread, and a man measured his words because he wanted a quiet spell to last. The gentle scent of pine smoke in a corner room made a space feel safe even when worry waited outside. It was not romance, but it let shoulders drop for an hour. People later forgot those weeks when the talk died down and the boats stayed close to home. They preferred a deck that smoked and a chase that leaped from one wave to the next. In the hush of those days, the past did not vanish and the future did not arrive. It just paused, like breath held in a chest. A person took what calm there was and did small chores. That was a kind of courage too. When the end came, the warning that followed carried the tale farther than any raid ever had. A head was set up as a lesson, and a message rode with the tides into many mouths. The cold bite of night air along a wharf made onlookers draw close collars as they stared and whispered. Boys dared each other to walk closer, then ran back laughing to hide their fear, and goodwives told them to come away. Sailors shook their heads as if they had seen too much to be stirred, though a few made signs as they passed. Soon a fiddle tune carried a rough rhyme about a beard and a fight and a final fall, and that tune traveled easier than news. In those lines the man turned into a figure who blamed the sea and took what he wanted. The law liked that shape, and the crowds liked it too, because it kept the world simple. That was how warnings worked. In the end, what remained for those who listened close was smaller and somehow steadier. It was a sense for tide, an account kept in the head, and a pause taken before a rash step. A hand rested on a cutlass only when words had failed, and even then the arm moved with care because waste never fed a crew. The taste of salt on the tongue stayed plain, without promise and without scorn, and it told the same story it always told. A person was not all one thing. The beard had been a frame, and the chords had been a trick, and the noise had been a cover for thought. Under that, the work had been hunger, nerve, and a weather eye. Folks would go on telling it loud as people do, but the quiet truth would still be there for anyone who wanted it. That was a good way to let a life rest. And so, our voyage with Blackbeard comes to an end. The guns fall silent, the sea grows calm, and the legend drifts into history. Until our next story together, rest well, dream deep, and good night.